Bramblewood Audio presents Little Daylight by George MacDonald, narrated by Cameron Ward. Part 1. No house of any pretension to be called a palace is in the least worthy of the name, except it has a wood near it, very near it, and the nearer, the better. Not all round it, I don't mean that. For a palace ought to be open to the sun and wind, and stand high and brave, with weathercocks glittering and flags flying. But on one side of every palace there must be a wood, and there was a very grand wood indeed beside the palace of the king, who was going to be Daylight's father. Such a grand wood that nobody yet had ever got to the other end of it. Near the house it was kept very trim and nice, and it was free of brushwood for a long way in, but by degrees it got wild, and it grew wilder, and wilder, and wilder, until some said wild beasts at last did what they liked in it. The king and his courtiers often hunted, however, and this kept the wild beasts far away from the palace. One glorious summer morning, when the wind and sun were out together, when the vanes were flashing and the flags frolicking against the blue sky, Little Daylight made her appearance from somewhere. Nobody could tell where. A beautiful baby, with such bright eyes that she might have come from the sun, only by and by she showed such lively ways that she might equally well have come out of the wind. There was great jubilation in the palace, for this was the first baby the queen had had, and there is as much happiness over a new baby in a palace as in a cottage. But there is one disadvantage of living near a wood. You do not know quite who your neighbors may be. Everybody knew there were in it several fairies, living within a few miles of the palace, who always had something to do with each new baby that came. For fairies live so much longer than we, that they can have business with a good many generations of human mortals. The curious houses they lived in were well known also, one a hollow oak, another a birch tree, though nobody could ever find how that fairy made a house of it. Another a hut of growing trees intertwined, and patched with turf and moss. But there was another fairy who had lately come to the place, and nobody even knew she was a fairy except the other fairies. A wicked old thing she was, always concealing her power, and being as disagreeable as she could, in order to tempt people to give her offense, that she might have the pleasure of taking vengeance upon them. The people about thought she was a witch, and those who knew her by sight were careful to avoid offending her. She lived in a mud house in a swampy part of the forest. In all history we find that fairies give their remarkable gifts to prince or princess, or any child of sufficient importance in their eyes, always at the christening. Now this we can understand, because it is an ancient custom amongst human beings as well. And it is not hard to explain why wicked fairies should choose the same time to do unkind things. But it is difficult to understand how they should be able to do them, for you would fancy all wicked creatures would be powerless on such an occasion. But I never knew of any interference on the part of the wicked fairy that did not turn out a good thing in the end. What a good thing, for instance, it was that one princess should sleep for 100 years. Was she not saved from all the plague of young men who were not worthy of her? And did she not come awake exactly at the right moment when the right prince kissed her? For my part, I cannot help wishing a good many girls would sleep till just the same fate overtook them. It would be happier for them, and more agreeable to their friends. Of course, all the known fairies were invited to the christening, but the king and queen never thought of inviting an old witch. For the power of the fairies they have by nature, whereas a witch gets her power by wickedness. The other fairies, however, knowing the danger thus run, provided as well as they could against accidents from her quarter. But they could neither render her powerless, nor could they arrange their gifts in reference to hers beforehand, for they could not tell what those might be. Of course, the old hag was there without being asked. Not to be asked was just what she wanted, that she might have a sort of reason for doing what she wished to do. For somehow, Even the wickedest of creatures likes a pretext for doing the wrong thing. 5 fairies had one after the other given the child such gifts as each counted best, and the 5th had just stepped back to her place in the surrounding splendor of ladies and gentlemen, when, mumbling a laugh between her toothless gums, the wicked fairy hobbled out into the middle of the circle, and at the moment when the archbishop was handing the baby to the lady at the head of the nursery department of state affairs, addressed him thus, giving a bite or two to every word before she could part with it.
"Please, your grace, I'm very deaf. Would your grace mind repeating the princess's name?"
"With pleasure, my good woman," said the archbishop, stooping to shout in her ear. "The infant's name is Little Daylight."
"And Little Daylight it shall be,"
cried the fairy, in the tone of a dry axle.
"And little good shall any of her gifts do her. For I bestow upon her the gift of sleeping all day long, whether she will or not. Ha-ha! Hee-hee! Hi-hi!"
Then out started the 6th fairy, who of course the others had arranged should come after the wicked one, in order to undo as much as she might.
"If she sleep all day," she said mournfully, "she shall at least wake all night."
A nice prospect for her mother and me, thought the poor king, for they loved her far too much to give her up to nurses, especially at night, as most kings and queens do, and are sorry for it afterwards.
"You spoke before I had done," said the wicked fairy. "That's against the law. It gives me another chance."
"I beg your pardon," said the other fairies all together.
"She did. I hadn't done laughing," said the crone. "I had only got to hi-hi, and I had to go through ho-ho and hoo-hoo. So I decree that if she wakes all night, she shall wax and wane with its mistress, the moon. And what that may mean, I hope her royal parents will live to see. Oh-ho! Hoo-hoo!"
But out stepped another fairy, for they had been wise enough to keep 2 in reserve, because every fairy knew the trick of one.
"Until," said the 7th fairy, "a prince comes who shall kiss her without knowing it."
The wicked fairy made a horrid noise like an angry cat, and hobbled away. She could not pretend that she had not finished her speech this time, for she had laughed ho-ho and hoo-hoo. "I don't know what that means," said the poor king to the 7th fairy.
"Don't be afraid. The meaning will come with the thing itself," said she.
The assembly broke up, miserable enough. The queen at last prepared for a good many sleepless nights, and the lady at the head of the nursery department anything but comfortable in the prospect before her, for of course the queen could not do it all. As for the king, he made up his mind, with what courage he could summon, to meet the demands of the case, but wondered whether he could with any propriety require the First Lord of the Treasury to take a share in the burden laid upon him. I will not attempt to describe what they had to go through for some time, but at last the household settled into a regular system, a very irregular one in some respects, for at certain seasons the palace rang all night with bursts of laughter from Little Daylight, whose heart the old fairy's curse could not reach. She was Daylight still, only a little in the wrong place, for she always dropped asleep at the first hint of dawn in the east. But her merriment was of short duration. When the moon was at the full, she was in glorious spirits, and as beautiful as it was possible for a child of her age to be. But as the moon waned, she faded, until at last she was wan and withered, like the poorest, sickliest child you might come upon, in the streets of a great city, in the arms of a homeless mother. Then the night was as quiet as the day, for the little creature lay in her gorgeous cradle night and day with hardly a motion, and indeed at last, without even a moan, like one dead. At first they often thought she was dead, but at last they got used to it, and only consulted the almanac to find the moment when she would begin to revive, which of course was with the first appearance of the silver thread of the crescent moon. Then she would move her lips, and they would give her a little nourishment, and she would grow better and better and better, until for a few days she was splendidly well. When well, she was always merriest out in the moonlight. But even when near her worst, She seemed better when in warm summer nights they carried her cradle out into the light of the waning moon. Then, in her sleep, she would smile the faintest, most pitiful smile. For a long time, very few people ever saw her awake. As she grew older, she became such a favorite, however, that about the palace there were always some who would contrive to keep awake at night in order to be near her. But she soon began to take every chance of getting away from her nurses and enjoying her moonlight alone. And thus things went on until she was nearly 17 years of age. Her father and mother had by that time got so used to the odd state of things that they had ceased to wonder at them. All their arrangements had reference to the state of Princess Daylight, and it is amazing how things contrived to accommodate themselves. But how any prince was ever to find and deliver her appeared inconceivable. As she grew older, she had grown more and more beautiful, with the sunniest hair and the loveliest eyes of heavenly blue, brilliant and profound as the sky of a June day. But so much more painful and sad was the change as her bad time came on. The more beautiful she was in the full moon, the more withered and worn did she become as the moon waned. At the time at which my story has now arrived, she looked, when the moon was small or gone, like an old woman exhausted with suffering. This was the more painful that her appearance was unnatural, for her hair and eyes did not change. Her wan face was both drawn and wrinkled, and had an eager, hungry look. Her skinny hands moved as if wishing, but unable, to lay hold of something. Her shoulders were bent forward. Her chest went in, and she stooped as if she were 80 years old. At last, she had to be put to bed, and there await the flow of the tide of life. But she grew to dislike being seen, still more being touched by any hands during this season. One lovely summer evening, when the moon lay all but gone upon the verge of the horizon, she vanished from her attendants, and it was only after searching for her a long time in great terror that they found her fast asleep in the forest, at the foot of a silver birch, and carried her home. A little way from the palace there was a great open glade, covered with the greenest and softest grass. This was her favorite haunt, for here the full moon shone free and glorious, while through a vista in the trees she could generally see more or less of the dying moon as it crossed the opening. Here she had a little rustic house built for her, and here she mostly resided. None of the court might go there without leave, and her own attendants had learned by this time not to be officious in waiting upon her, so that she was very much at liberty. Whether the good fairies had anything to do with it or not, I cannot tell, but at last she got into the way of retreating further into the wood every night as the moon waned, so that sometimes they had great trouble in finding her. But as she was always very angry if she discovered they were watching her, they scarcely dared to do so. At length one night they thought they had lost her altogether. It was morning before they found her. Feeble as she was, she had wandered into a thicket a long way from the glade, and there she lay, fast asleep, of course. Although the fame of her beauty and sweetness had gone abroad, yet as everybody knew she was under a bad spell, no king in the neighborhood had any desire to have her for a daughter-in-law. There were serious objections to such a relation. About this time, in a neighboring kingdom, in consequence of the wickedness of the nobles, an insurrection took place upon the death of the old king. The greater part of the nobility was massacred, and the young prince was compelled to flee for his life, disguised like a peasant. For some time, until he got out of the country, he suffered much from hunger and fatigue. But when he got into that ruled by the princess's father, and had no longer any fear of being recognized, he fared better, for the people were kind. He did not abandon his disguise, however. One tolerable reason was that he had no other clothes to put on, and another that he had very little money, and did not know where to get any more. There was no good in telling everybody he met that he was a prince, for he felt that a prince ought to be able to get on like other people, else his rank only made a fool of him. He had read of princes setting out upon adventure, and here he was out in similar case, only without having had a choice in the matter. he would go on and see what would come of it. For a day or two he had been walking through the palace wood, and had had next to nothing to eat, when he came upon the strangest little house, inhabited by a very nice, tidy, motherly old woman. This was one of the good fairies. The moment she saw him, she knew quite well who he was, and what was going to come of it. But she was not at liberty to interfere with the orderly march of events. She received him with a kindness she would have shown to any other traveler, and gave him bread and milk, which he thought the most delicious food he had ever tasted, wondering that they did not have it for dinner at the palace sometimes. The old woman pressed him to stay all night. When he awoke, he was amazed to find how well and strong he felt. She would not take any of the money he offered, but begged him, if he found occasion of continuing in the neighborhood, to return and occupy the same quarters. "Thank you much, good mother," answered the prince, "but there is little chance of that. The sooner I get out of this wood, the better." "I don't know that," said the fairy. "What do you mean?" asked the prince. "Why, how should I know?" returned she. "I can't tell," said the prince. "Very well," said the fairy. "How strangely you talk," said the prince. "Do I?" said the fairy. "Yes, you do," said the prince. "Very well," said the fairy. The prince was not used to being spoken to in this fashion, so he felt a little angry and turned and walked away. But this did not offend the fairy. She stood at the door of her little house looking after him till the trees hid him quite. Then she said, "At last," and went in. The prince wandered and got nowhere. The sun sank and went out of sight, and he seemed no nearer the end of the wood than ever. He sat down on a fallen tree, ate a bit of bread the old woman had given him, and waited for the moon. For although he was not much of an astronomer, he knew the moon would rise sometime, because she had risen the night before. Up she came, slow and slow, but of a good size, pretty nearly round indeed. Whereupon, greatly refreshed with his piece of bread, he got up and went, he knew not whither. After walking a considerable distance, he thought he was coming to the outside of the forest. But when he reached what he thought the last of it, he found himself only upon the edge of a great open space in it, covered with grass. The moon shone very bright, and he thought he had never seen a more lovely spot. Still, it looked dreary because of its loneliness, for he could not see the house at the other side. He sat down, weary again, and gazed into the glade. He had not seen so much room for several days. All at once he spied something in the middle of the grass. What could it be? It moved. It came nearer. Was it a human creature, gliding across? A girl dressed in white, gleaming in the moonshine? She came nearer and nearer. He crept behind a tree and watched, wondering. It must be some strange being of the wood, a nymph whom the moonlight and the warm, dusky air had enticed from her tree. But when she came close to where he stood, he no longer doubted she was human, for he had caught sight of her sunny hair, and her clear blue eyes, and the loveliest face and form that he had ever seen. All at once she began singing like a nightingale, and dancing to her own music, with her eyes ever turned towards the moon. She passed close to where he stood, dancing on by the edge of the trees and away in a great circle towards the other side, until he could see but a spot of white in the yellowish green of the moonlit grass. But when he feared it would vanish quite, the spot grew, and became a figure once more. She approached him again, singing and dancing, and waving her arms over her head, until she had completed the circle. Just opposite his tree she stood, ceased her song, dropped her arms, and broke out into a long, clear laugh, musical as a brook. Then, as if tired, she threw herself on the grass, and lay gazing at the moon. The prince was almost afraid to breathe, lest he should startle her, and she should vanish from his sight. As to venturing near her, that never came into his head. This concludes Part 1 of Little Daylight by George MacDonald. Lord willing, I'll release part 2 around this time next week. Thanks for listening.